Civil Rights and MLK Non-Fights. I am, as always, your host, Christopher Paul Dugdale, MEDMA. We are Duncanville High School in these United States, and today is March 26, 2021. And on this date in history, in 1973, the U.S. withdrew their troops from, 1975. The U.S. withdrew their troops from Vietnam, really ending the Vietnam War for us. Very tragic day. The embassy was overrun. A lot of bad things happened on that day. So everyone have a better day than that. Don't have your embassy overrun. Okay, so let's talk about Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. And this is a court case that's always cited for changing everything in education. And in truth, it really doesn't change anything. So Linda Brown was trying to go to a school right by her house. The school was about a block away without any major traffic in the way. But her school was about 2.5 miles away, and part of that was through a major railroad crossing where trains were running constantly, and it was very dangerous for a little 6-year-old, 5-year-old, 14-year-old to cross. So her parents, and 5 other families got together to sue the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. And it's called Brown versus Board of Education because her name was first alphabetically. Sorry if that takes away some of the fun and magic you might have thought that might have been. The Supreme Court rules that segregation was unconstitutional in schools. Only in schools. And violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. They had a chance to rule and end segregation everywhere, but they did it just in schools. And to be honest, over the next 20 years, there's really no major desegregation. Districts would just redraw lines so that all the black people went to the black school and all the white people went to the white school. And they would draw district lines and sometimes have one little dot of a house or apartment and then have a line going all the way over to the black community to make sure that everyone was district the same. And it would take about 20 years for them to be able to figure out how to change that. Thurgood Marshall, he's on the left-hand side. He's in the middle picture. He was chief counsel of the NAACP, so every time the NAACP went to court, he was the one who would argue the case. He did several different rulings, and he will become the first Supreme Court justice, the first black Supreme Court justice. Many Southerners thought they could fight against Brown versus the Board of Education decision and a lot of other rules that were passed by Northerners, and they shut down schools in 6 states to keep out black students. Now, how do you fund the civil rights movement? Well, churches, African American churches raised money and played a key role in the civil rights movement. In Dallas, the NAACP, the Dallas Negro Chamber of Commerce, and several other organizations would meet in churches every Sunday and Wednesday, and sometimes at other days, times during the week, to help fund their programs and to help get people more involved. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference is one of these first major organizations to pop up outside of the NAACP, and they challenge segregation in housing and transportation and in public and voting booths, and they also fought for voting rights. They were led by a young minister by the name of Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. Dr. King graduated with his PhD when he was 16 years old. He was a brilliant man, very well spoken, one of the most charismatic men of the last at least century, if not further than that. He believed in nonviolent passive resistance. This is something that had been practiced by Gandhi, by Cesar Chavez, Alice Paul. Several other civil rights leaders will use this idea of nonviolent passive resistance from Henry David Thoreau, civil disobedience. We can have a revolution without fighting. All we have to do is make the other side look like they're the jerks. And there was no hardship in doing this during the civil rights movement. The Montgomery bus boycott. Rosa Parks, uh, pictured top left and also on the right, she was riding home on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. She was not the first person arrested for not giving up her seat or not getting off the bus. During these times, if you were on a bus and there weren't enough seats, they would have African Americans give up their seats or get off the bus to get on, a future bus to be able to get to where they needed to go. Uh, it continued for over a year, and African Americans were able to get around using the bus by carpooling or walking. Uh, the majority of people who rode the buses at that time were African Americans, and so it actually was pushing the company into bankruptcy. And the owner of the company said, "My grandfather didn't start this company, so no," insert racial slur, could take the company away from him. Uh, but the U.S. Supreme Court decided that they would declare segregation unconstitutional on buses. So once again, by the way, the reason that Rosa Parks was supported and the other woman wasn't is the woman who was arrested 6 months before had a baby out of wedlock, and there was there were these two horrible generalizations about African Americans. Uh, one that they were savage animals, and then the other ones we'll get into here at a later time. But the whole idea of civil disobedience was to change this whole view of savage animals. In fact, the people that were the savage animals during all this were the white people who were claiming that the African Americans were were these horrible brutes that they didn't want their kids around, when in reality they were the brutes. So Dwight D. Eisenhower signs this Civil Rights Act of 1957, and it protects the African American right to vote, but it was worthless. Yeah, I'm sorry. There's not much more I can say about that, but it was an attempt by Congress to do something, just not a very good one. So congratulations, Congress. Okay, so Central High School, Little Rock, Arkansas. Governor Orvis Fabus. He was actually elected and was in support of civil rights to get elected. But he thought to hold on to his position of power, he was going to have to fight Brown versus the Board of Education. He ordered the National Guard to keep out African American students. By the way, Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, is still there today, and you can go and visit it. They have a neat civil rights museum across the street. It's a beautiful campus. It's about the size of Duncanville. In fact, uh, they could have easily handled all the students from uh, all the African American students in Little Rock. They actually rented out part of the space in the building to a local college because they needed the space and they just weren't using it at that time. So a federal judge is going to demand that the National Guard be removed and that the students would be allowed to go into school. So the first day, the students all get together. There's 9 students. They get together to talk about what to do that day in school. One of the 9 students didn't get the message. They tried to go there together, and so 8 of the students made it into the building without the crowd watching. The crowd descended on, I believe her name was Winnie Mae, and were threatening to kill her there. One of the women there put her back on the bus and sent her back home and saved her life. The crowd became horrified whenever they found out that the black students were in the building, and several of them said, or came to the school with demands saying, "Hey, if you let us hang one of the students, we'll let the rest of the students go home." At this point, Eisenhower was infuriated and he decided to take actions into his own hands. He ordered the U.S. Army to surround the school, and the students were escorted into the building. And they stayed there for the rest of the year. The next school year, Orvis Faber closed the school, and it was closed a few years before they reopened it. Now, I know it seems like we're changing course here, but at the same time this is going on, the United States is getting involved in Vietnam. Up on the top left-hand side, that is Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh had been around for a long time. In 1917, at the age of 18, I'm sorry, 1919, at the age of 18, he approaches Woodrow Wilson at the Treaty of Versailles, and at that point, Wilson and several of the other leaders were dividing up Europe to make sure that uh, everyone had their own country, then everyone was happy, and there'd be no more rebellion. Ho Chi Minh thought this was a perfect time to do the same thing for Vietnam. When he was turned down, he formed the Indochinese Communist Party and got help from the Soviet Union, and he gets kicked out of Vietnam. About 20 years later, whenever the Japanese had overrun Vietnam during World War II, he formed a group called the Viet Minh, and their whole thing was to force Japan out of Vietnam. The U.S. will actually help him, send him supplies, and help him beat the Japanese. He was able to unite communist and non-communist. And after World War II, he declared Vietnam a nation. But France wanted back its colony, so it was allowed to take back over Vietnam. Now, France did not have the ability to keep all of its territories the way it was, and Eisenhower had this theory called the domino theory and said that if Vietnam falls to communism, Asia would do the same. Okay, Dien Bien Phu. So in 1954, about 9 years after Japan took control of Vietnam again, the Viet Minh defeated the French, and they were forced to leave Indochina, French Indochina. Now that's French Indochina in the bottom left-hand side. That is Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. That's what we think of those countries today, and that's what they would become shortly after. Now, normally whenever you want a revolution like this, you were able to form your own nation, but most of the world was not comfortable with this. So they got together in Geneva, and they divided French Indochina into Cambodia and Laos. Cambodia is the yellow country, Laos is the orange country. North Vietnam Vietnam was divided into two. Vietnam was communist, and South Vietnam was pro-Western. And this is where the problems will start. Now, meanwhile, in the United States, the Congress of Racial Equality. Okay, this is led by James Farmer. They use sit-ins to protest segregation in restaurants. So in Greensboro, North Carolina, in 1959, 4 black students staged a sit-in at Woolworth's whites-only lunch counter. So the only people that could sit at the counter were white people. Okay, I know it's ironic that the person working behind the counter is black, but we won't get into that. Actually, we will. It doesn't make any sense. Now, Woolworths was a high-end department store. Okay, the best thing I can do to compare this to, because there's not a lot of places to eat in your department stores, is kind of like that front area of Target where you can go and sit down and eat. Okay, uh, not only did this happen in Greensboro, but this will inspire several other sit-ins throughout the United States, and this will help end segregation in many facilities in northern cities. Okay, don't worry about writing all this down. Okay, I mainly have this because people are generally interested. The guy sitting down in the chair is Joseph Kennedy. Joseph Kennedy was a diplomat to Britain uh, during World War II. He wanted to create this great dynasty of his family. So, everyone's heard of the Kennedy curse. If not, then I'll try and tear through this pretty quick. Okay. Joseph Kennedy Jr. was his oldest son, and he was the one who they wanted to really give a position of importance, uh, make him the next president of the United States as soon as he was available. So, to build up his reputation, he became a fighter pilot in World War II, volunteered for these very dangerous missions. It was called Project Aphrodite, where they would take planes, fill them with bombs, and a pilot would take off. Now, after they took off, that pilot would jump out of the plane. They would fly the plane by radio control and go and crash into a target. Okay. Joseph Kennedy didn't make it out of the plane, and he died during one of the test runs. Okay. John F. Kennedy. You've heard his story before. He was killed in Dallas on Elm Street uh, by Lee Harvey Oswald from the sixth floor of the school book depository. That was in November of 1963. You'll hear about that, but I don't think you hear about that until next week. Okay? So right now, the Kennedy family, we are 0 for 2, and that's out of 9. Rosemary Kennedy was the oldest daughter, but she was mentally retarded. To try and help fix her condition, they gave her a lobotomy, and uh, she would live for the next 60 years, missing major parts of her brain. 0 for 3. Kathleen Kennedy. She was married to this British lord, William Cavendish. Uh, she was cheating on him, and she went skiing in the Alps in Europe with her married boyfriend, and they died in a plane crash. 0 for 4. Okay. Now, I know what you're thinking. This is something that will fix everything. Eunice Kennedy, she married Robert Shriver. Her daughter, Maria Shriver, married Arnold Schwarzenegger. And, well, he cheated on his wife with their maid. And his two sons were able to be raised together without knowing that they were sons, even though they looked a lot alike and were built like dad. I don't know. Patricia Kennedy, she married Peter Lawford. Uh, kind of boring. Robert Kennedy, we got a couple things here. Okay. He marries a woman by the name of Ethel Skakel. He was killed in L.A. in 1968 on June 4th, uh, going to speak to a crowd. He was running for president. Uh, he was killed by a man by the name of Sirhan Sirhan. Sirhan Sirhan was crazy and had written in a notebook, probably somewhere around 30,000 times, "I will kill Robert Kennedy," over and over and over and over again. Okay, so that happened in 1968, 52 years ago. By the way, his nephew, uh, he had Tommy and Michael Skakel were his nephews. Tommy was 16, uh, and Michael was 18. They had a neighbor by the name of Martha Moxley, and they both thought she was cute. She was 14. Uh, she liked Tommy, and Michael didn't like that, even though Michael did meet her first. So one night after a party at their house while mom and dad were out of town, uh, Tommy, uh, well, Michael saw that Martha was more interested in Tommy than him, and so when she walked home, he beat her to death with a golf club and stabbed her with the broken end of it and pulled down her pants to shame her. The murder went, this was in 1975. He was arrested in 2003 and spent about 3 years in jail before the rich attorneys in his family uh, got him out. Gene Kennedy married Stephen Smith. For those of you who know who he is, it's not Stephen A. Smith, it's a different Stephen Smith. Ted Kennedy, the young boy there wearing the white jacket. Wait, no, I'm sorry. He's the young boy sitting in Joseph's lap. Uh, he was the last of the Kennedy boys. By the way, if you're following the count so far, we are 5 for 8 in some type of horrible disaster, but not with good old Ted. No. So the year after his brother was assassinated, he was going to a fundraiser. He left his wife at home with their 4 kids and went to the party with his pregnant girlfriend, Mary Jo Kopechne. He had way too much to drink and accidentally drove off the bridge. He got out of the car, but she didn't. He went to a hotel, spent the night, and the next day called the police, hoping that they could save her. Yeah, she was dead. Uh, Somehow he didn't go to jail. Uh, People heard about this, but it was kind of swept under the rug until uh, Edward Kennedy, also known as Ted. By the way, Ted is somehow an abbreviation for Edward. I can't explain that to you. Okay, it killed any hopes he had of becoming president. By the way, Robert Kennedy was known as Bobby because Bobby is short for Robert. Even though you have Robbie and Rob, you also have Bob and Bobby. Bobby is not short for Bobbert. John, by the way, he went by Jack because Jack is short for John. If you're counting at home, that's 4 letters in each, and I can't explain that either. Joseph Kennedy Jr. went by Joe, Joe. Yeah, and by the way, the father did too. So anyway, sorry for the long explanation. The election of 1960, you had Democrat John F. Kennedy. He was Catholic. He's only the second Catholic to ever get the nomination of a major political party. He went against Richard Nixon, who was a Quaker. In the televised debates, uh, Robert Kennedy helped get MLK out of jail, and this helped secure the the black vote. Okay. Uh, by the way, Kennedy will also promise to do a lot of things to help get rights for African Americans. In a little bit over 1,000 days, he really does absolutely nothing unless he's pressured by the press to do something. To get more support in the South, because he lost support by promising rights to African Americans, uh, he chose Lyndon Baines Johnson of Texas to be his vice president, who was very powerful in Congress. Uh, so they had these televised debates between Nixon and Kennedy. It was the first ones that had ever been put on television. Uh, Nixon was sick. He had a fever. He was sweating. Uh, Kennedy smiled at the camera. Nixon didn't. So people that watched the debates thought that Kennedy did the better job. People that listened on the radio liked Nixon a little bit better. Okay, if you look at how close the vote is extremely close. But because of some swing states in Illinois and Texas, by the way, the number of dead people that voted for Kennedy and LBJ was ridiculously high. Uh, Mafia connections from Kennedy's father Joseph, who was a bootlegger of alcohol during Prohibition in the 20s, uh, helped secure the vote in Illinois, and I believe there's also some seedy stuff in some other states too that really uh, made it possible for Kennedy to win. Uh, JFK won, so I'll call Kennedy JFK now. He was the youngest elected president, 43. The youngest president was still Teddy Roosevelt at 42, but he wasn't elected into that position. So now I move forward. I hope everyone's having fun today. It's a beautiful Wednesday. During his inauguration, he comes forward and challenges the nation. Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. So part of his plan is called the New Frontier, and this is how he's going to fix the U.S. He's going to put more money into education, elderly health insurance, and help migrant workers. You see nothing in there about helping African Americans. JFK has a real reputation for doing things to improve the lives of African Americans, but it's not him, it's LBJ that actually gets things passed. Should give credit where credit is due. Now, to help out countries around the world, he establishes the Peace Corps, which is still around. This helps less developed nations fight poverty. Young Americans would go through training and then go 2 years over, helping teach farming techniques, water purification, several other things too in a third world country. By the way, a first world country would be countries like the United States and most of Western Europe. A second world country would be a communist nation. And third world nations are basically anyone who's not one of those first two groups. So the majority of the world fell into third world country status, and most of them were extremely impoverished, kind of like second world nations. So the Alliance for Progress. We once again have discovered that most of Latin America really helps us. Okay, so the U.S. tries to improve diplomacy with Latin America and improves for a short period of time. Some countries like Venezuela really get on board with this, but the problem is we still go in and cause problems. So I'm moving on. Chief Justice Earl Warren. Okay, he helped the civil rights movement. He helps freedom of the press, separation of church and state, and the rights of the accused. Okay, so I can go in any order on this, but I'm going to start here and then I'm going to go back. And I'm sorry if you don't like it. I'm so sorry, but not that sorry. Okay, so anyway, white versus register. Okay, uh, reapportionment is unconstitutional against minorities and racial groups. Uh, reapportionment is the way that states draw political districts, and the whole thought here is if you draw the lines correctly, you can take advantage of some of the minority groups that live in town. Okay, so if you have a group of 5 regions of town, and you have a 60% African American population in town, you can actually put all of the African American votes into 2 of the regions, and then divide the other 3 regions with the rest of the African American population, and get 3 of the 5 representatives from the smaller white minority in town. And things like this were done all the way throughout the United States. By the way, I never promised that this was going to be fair. But Earl Warren actually does take a stance to try and stop this kind of thing from happening. Okay, Mendez versus Westminster. This rules against the racial segregation of Hispanic students in California. Okay, in the 1940s, Americans found it very important to start segregating Hispanic students. In Delgado versus Bastrop in 1948, the educational segregation of Mexican students is unconstitutional. Things get really bad when the schools or when the Supreme Court tries to force segregation into schools. And so whenever white students have to go to black schools, they choose Hispanic students to go over. And that causes problems between African Americans and Hispanic Americans, where there wasn't one before. Sweat versus Painter. Okay, on the left-hand side, that's Herman Sweat. He tried to go to law school at UT. Okay, but he was told he had to go to Southern. UT had 52 professors in their law department and over 6 million books in their law library. So, they take this to the Supreme Court. Southern, by the way, had 9 professors and about 7,000 books. So they made the argument that there was no way to have uh, separate but equal education, separate but equal educational opportunities. So uh, the Supreme Court will actually allow Herman Sweat to kind of go to UT. And by kind of go, he got to sit in the hall outside the classroom. That was the way of allowing him to go to school, but not disrupt the classroom. You know, I'm moving on. Okay, Hernandez versus Texas. Mexican Americans can't be excluded from juries. Many people hate jury duty, but the problem with it is if you ever get in trouble, you want people that are like you on your jury. It would give you a better chance whenever you go in front of the judge or in front of the jury who are making a decision on your rights. Okay. By the way, I don't know if you noticed the background, but whenever it's blue with the Supreme Court building in the bottom left-hand corner, that means that it is a, uh, uh, something to do with civil rights. So Tinker versus Des Moines. Okay, this limits freedom of speech in public schools when it interferes with discipline. Uh, Basically, there were a lot of people that were against the Vietnam War, and so they decided to wear, as protest, black armbands. The problem was the students that had family members serving in Vietnam thought that this was a way of attacking and not supporting the troops as Americans did in previous wars. And so the fact that it interfered with discipline allowed uh, the schools to ban freedom of speech in public schools. While you're learning about this, you don't necessarily have the rights. On the bottom left-hand side, you see Loving versus Virginia. Okay, uh, that is the Loving couple on the left-hand side. They went to several states to try and challenge whether or not you could have a biracial marriage. Uh, they moved until they found a state that was willing to prosecute them. Uh, Sad part of the story, they had 2 children together, and he died uh, in 1971. So even though they won this major victory in the Supreme Court, they didn't get to have a long life together.